right, thank you, Ellen, very much for the more brief introduction this time and appropriate. And hello, Temple Sinai congregation and others. Thank you. A deep thank you and a very appreciative thank you for coming out in what is a busy first week of December evening. And I also want to thank, certainly by name, a few folks, which I didn't last time. I'd like to thank Greg and Mindy from our Marketing and Communications Department at Rowan College for helping to promote this series and this event. I'd like to thank Johanna, Aaron, others at Temple Sinai for logistically, technologically setting these Zoom events up. And also, of course, to Ellen for the larger sort of organization of this series and this event, in this particular event this evening as well. So let me bring up my screen here. We were together exactly, I think, 5 weeks ago to the day. Last time when we were together, we talked about and went through and outlined this extremist ideology that has grown and is now a substantial portion of Republican voters, nationalist Republican voters in the United States. And if you look at the media coverage of this from our sort of large-scale media sources, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, take your pick, I suppose. It is quite common. This has, of course, gotten a lot of media coverage, the spread of these beliefs, so these conspiracy beliefs, over the past few years. It is quite common to refer to this movement, if you will, this political movement, as a quote-unquote cult, right? For any of you that have read the news the past few years, you've probably heard that term thrown around by analysts and by journalists and by others, even academics, a lot. And I argued last time, I think, with you all, made the argument that that's not really the clearest way or the most accurate way, really, to think about this, for a few reasons. The principles of this set of beliefs that are political in nature, they have political content and have political goals and ends in mind, are one, political, and two, the way that this movement has operated and the principles which it operates from generally paralleled historical examples of nationalism, fascism, and even extremist ideological movements historically, and even currently in the world. I think I gave the examples last time of two of the most famous and probably in the United States most known examples of nationalism historically, recently in the world. Of course, that would be Mussolini's Italian nationalism and fascism of the late 19th and early 20th century, and of course, German nationalism and fascism of the early and mid 20th century. Of course, that was mostly under Hitler. What happens in these situations? What happens is we have a sizable, medium to large-scale group in a territory, a region, a country, a nation, that comes to, for various reasons, dislike, intensely dislike, and even to the way of hating another medium to large scale group that is also in their territory, region, or nation. And so this is generally what's happened, I'm going to argue, continually argue, in the United States. Now, to sustain that belief system, because it's an extreme type of dislike and even hatred, what groups do generally is they create a set of conspiracies to be able to sustain this hatred beyond any one news event or historical event that occurs. So you see this pattern time and time and again throughout history, whereby a group will say, okay, this other group is in charge. They are maybe in charge of the government. They have way too much power. They are doing bad things to us. Whether this is real or not, it doesn't matter. They make up these sort of conspiratorial values and beliefs around us to explain these phenomena. And the reasons for this intergroup hatred can be immense. Many different reasons why. Maybe the group that is doing the hating thinks they are economically disadvantaged at the expense of another group in some way. Maybe they think the group in charge is, selling out the national interest to international forces in some way. Again, I'm not making these as accurate statements. I'm just saying these are the belief system, right? This is the set of beliefs. Maybe they think that they're letting in international forces like immigrants who the group that feels are the rightful heirs of the nation, maybe because of their ethnicity, don't like. Maybe the groups are geographically separated, living in different places in the country, right? Maybe rural, urban, or maybe just in different parts of the country. You could, there's many other potential reasons why. I think we can even see some of those reasons again when you look at the people perceiving these beliefs and these conspiracy beliefs from the groups that we're talking about. You can see those sort of patterns here as well. So you make up these conspiracy theories about the other group and how they are conspiring together secretly to control things. And then because those people then are seen and perceived as in charge and conspiring against you, well, then you have to make a movement against them. And sometimes it even can become a partially violent movement to overthrow them and get in power. And then an overthrow of them and your group getting in power then brings about a sort of utopia or a type of your group in power. We will be in charge and everything will be, hunky-dory, okay? This is extremist ideology politically anywhere we see it in the world. And so in general sense, we're seeing a similar pattern here, unfortunately, in the United States. So what we're going to do, hopefully summarizing a little bit what we did last time, the last few minutes, with the discussion here, a growing conspiracy, the scope of and reasons for QAnon beliefs among U.S. nationalists. What I'm going to walk you through this evening is we're going to try to answer the question of how big of a problem is this? In terms of, the number of people that actually hold these beliefs, maybe just some of the beliefs, but still hold them sincerely. And so I'm going to show you what are hopefully the best representations of some large-scale polling data that we have in the country, political polls where surveyors go out and ask people about their political beliefs and their ideology and their value sets and all of this sort of stuff. Random samples, big swaths of the adult population, 18 years and above, registered voters and otherwise across many different subgroups of the population that show us percentage-wise, estimates of how many people actually believe these sort of high conspiracy sort of beliefs and have this sort of mindset, okay? So that's our sort of goal, is this a big problem? Should we be concerned about it? Should we not be? And so that's what we're going to try to do, and I'm going to try to walk you through here and have a discussion with you about that this evening. So I've done this before. I do want to make a disclaimer here before I start with some of the photos and then get into some of the discussion here. I know, this is not always the nicest set of topics to talk about. I understand that. I'm generally myself try to be a good-natured person, of course. It's been a little bit of a challenge understanding and researching culture and politics, which I do, to research this stuff because it can be a little bit downtrodden and a little bit depressing. I think we had a comment or two about that in our question session back in October when we were together last. Like I tell my students, I'm a social scientist. I'm here to present you the evidence and I'm here to tell you reality, whether that's good or bad. So I hope, even though we're talking about a topic that can be seen as a serious problem about our politics in the country, I will try to keep it upbeat when I can, and hopefully in our discussion we can have a nice discussion about it as well, even though the subject matter can sometimes be admittedly a little bit dark. So we have here, now I do my own field work with people that have this belief set and these beliefs. And now I have agreements with them. I do have some photos of my informants and my people that I interview in my own research. I have made agreements with them because they like to stay anonymous, not to show their photos, of course. So I unfortunately cannot show their photos, but I do crowdsource some of the photos here to sort of represent some of the types of folks that I'm talking about when we sort of get in our sort of framework here, how to think about these things with a few photos to start with. So here we have inside a nationalist rally, a Donald Trump rally from recent years. We've got multiple people here holding up the "We Are Q" signs, right? This, of course, references this set of conspiracy principles and beliefs, the QAnon and associated sources that we looked at last time. And, multiple signs here. We've got even the lady here in the forefront of the photo with the "We Are Q" shirt. These folks have invested time and money and energy into actually showing and buying the merch, if you will, and the gear to show that they are these they believe these conspiracy theories, quite largely. And I submit to you that, not to be maybe too blunt or too stereotypical, but, these are pretty middle of America, typical normal looking folks, right? Maybe you look like your friends and neighbors, perhaps. If we were to rewind maybe 10 or 20 years and we were to think about people of extremist ideology, maybe we would have some stereotypes, right? Maybe young kids at college campuses with punk rock hairdos or that sort of thing, or, constantly carrying around signs and protests or other stuff. But this is going to go along with the theme this evening, is that these conspiracy beliefs, and they certainly represent an extreme set of beliefs about politics in the world, is fairly widespread across a lot of different demographic groups in the country. It's not just our young folks on campus. It's not just old folks. It's a lot of different groups by age, by education level, by many different ways we want to cut it. So hopefully this sort of starts to maybe represent that theme a little bit. I'll show you maybe one or two other photos here just as representation of this theme. We see here another Donald Trump rally with the shirt, the gear, the conspiracy gear. Where we go one, we go all. There's an acronym for this, WWGWGA. That's a long mouthful of an acronym, of course. That is, any extremist ideology has slogans, right, that unite the group or try to unite the group under a set of beliefs. And so this is one of the main slogans, maybe you've seen it before, of the QAnon conspiracy cohort. And so it means, we're united. We have this very hardline set of beliefs. We all believe it, and we will take action. Maybe some of us will when necessary, because where we go one, all of us go together, and we go with the leader and all of that. So it's a very sort of authoritarian mindset sort of slogan, if you will. And you've got the Q represented there with the American flag. And again, maybe a husband, wife, or boyfriend, girlfriend couple here. Could look like anybody you're living next to, perhaps. Not necessarily too out of the ordinary. So again, sort of going along with this theme we're going to talk about tonight of this being a more mainstream thing, unfortunately, maybe, than we think. One more photo here. We've got the QAnon shirt represented in the front there with the gentleman on the left with the thumbs down. Must be talking about it's a Trump rally, Democratic Party official, I suppose. But let's not stereotype too much either. Yes, by far and away, when we look at the numbers of people that behold to this mindset, certainly much of it is white, ethnically white America. But understand too, this also cross-cuts a bit into the African American and Hispanic American communities. I don't mean to cherry pick a photo here, but we have seen at the Trump rallies, and we see it in the polling data too that I will show you. We have members of the African American community. We see it represented up front here of this photo at a Trump rally, and they've got the signs "Blacks for Trump" and also a gods2.com, a conspiracy sort of website reference there on that sign. And so we just, one of the things I like to do is, again, sort of break down stereotypes a bit. And it's oftentimes thought, well, this is 95, 98, sort of percent, QAnon conspiracy believers, sort of white America. Now, again, that is certainly the vast majority of it. But there are also, across ethnic groups, representation in these nationalist sort of voters and nationalist activists and believers too. So Donald Trump and other people that represent the nationalist ideology actually did have a lot of inroads with working class and middle class Hispanics in the last election. And now you may say, well, how can that be? There's some occasional racist rhetoric in this larger nationalist ideology. Even Donald Trump, and some of the representatives of this engage in it himself. How could this be? Well, let's remember that with any individual, there's a hierarchy of how people think about issues and things, right? When they vote or when they think about politics. And so even though there may be contradictions there for an African American or Hispanic American, there are some other things that are important and are superseding in their minds when they support this ideology, those other factors, okay? So again, it may be a contradiction to us, but it does occasionally happen. Conspiracy theories are old. They go back a long way, since the dawn of civilization, really. We don't have time to get into all of that, but maybe we could take a more recent example in the United States, just for context here. If we were to look back within the past, 50, 60, 70 years in the U.S. population, people believing conspiracy theories, it certainly exists. It certainly has existed and does continue to exist. One of the most famous, of course, maybe one-off historical events is the moon landing, right? people in the population believing that, well, okay, the moon landing was fake. You've probably heard this theory before, right? So this is, of course, one of our major, news and social events of the past, 60, 70, 80 years, last century. And so I'm just showing you some recent polling data here from an Ipsos NPR, National Public Radio, very high quality, thousands of U.S. population here broken down by party affiliation. Polling here basically, those that are saying, yes, it was true that people, United States landed on the moon, or false that they didn't, meaning that the false would be those that basically believe in, a fake moon landing and kind of conspiratorial thinking. Now, this is showing, okay, so, it kind of somewhat even across different groups, Republicans, Democrats, Independents. Basically, historically, when we look at these type of things, anywhere usually from about 7, even up to 20% of the American population, going back decades and even further, as long as we have as far back as we have polling data on this, believe in one or multiple sort of one-off conspiracy events, either the moon landing or some others, okay? That's pretty consistent. Now, that sounds like a lot, right? I mean, here we see what, anywhere from 7 to 10%, maybe something like that. So we also have the don't know category, which we have to take as a little ambivalent. Understand the people that say they don't know whether this was, happened or not, or was a conspiracy, that can bleed into the conspiracy side sometimes in other polls. But we generally get anywhere from maybe 1 in 10, 1 in 7, 1 in 6, even 1 in 5 people that generally believe in our society of one or multiple, again, sort of conspiracy events happening previously in the U.S. Now, I'll show you one more example of this more recently. The numbers will be pretty similar. 9/11, right? There were conspiracy, obviously a horrible and, very obviously highly significant political and social event, of course, in the country. More recently, of course, past the turn of the century. And even more recently, we see similar numbers here, right, in a general sense, right? That there's anywhere maybe from 5 to 10%, and some polls will show you consistently as well up to maybe 15 or plus percent. People saying, well, the September 11th attacks, were not carried out by al-Qaeda terrorists. There's a lot of different conspiracies surrounding this. Perhaps, the George W. Bush administration knew about it, or perhaps it wasn't terrorists, but somebody else, or like domestic terrorists, or there's a whole bunch of different things. We call these folks 9/11 truthers, and there are other names for these smaller movements that smaller cohorts, I should say, that believe these things. The point here is that, okay, so we've had historically, consistently, I mean, conspiracy theories are as old as the United States as well. We've always had anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15, some percentage of people that believe some level of conspiracy. The fundamental difference between then and now, the 2010s and going forward, is that what we see now is a complete conspiracy, a connection of many different conspiracies, not just these one-off events, because these two things I've just shown you, people may believe, okay, there were some high-level people that conspired that maybe knew about these events, but it's just isolated to those events only. It's not an explanation of how the world works ideologically and how, this one group controls everything within the country and globally as well at all times. So even though we see maybe some similar numbers, it's a fundamental difference between the sort of old conspirizing and the new conspirizing, because the new conspirizing is the sort of thing that, again, is much more politically connected in the bigger picture. It is connected with these political ends. It is connected with this hatred of other groups in the society, much more systematically than, again, these one-off important historical events. So I just wanted to give that as sort of context. We've always had conspiracies in the U.S., but now I would argue it's a fundamentally different thing because of the scale of the conspiracy and the nature of it, if you will. Okay, let me give you a little summary here to start off with, okay? Now, again, some of you that follow the news, you may have seen occasionally, the news, our major news outlets report the results of political polling, that show us the percentage of people that believe X or Y or Z or what have you, right? I do give you one more disclaimer here before we start into interpreting this a little bit. This always frustrates me a little bit. Like if you turn on MSNBC or CNN or take any, or maybe read any of your newspaper sources, what have you, Um, whether it's looking at a political race, like between like who's going to win the presidency or be the governor, or what percentage of people believe X or Y or Z on a certain issue. I've heard a lot of reporters, a lot of journalists will say the following, like, well, 28% of people believe this, like 28%, exactly that. Well, no, that's not the correct way to interpret this. I just want to remind you all that when we look at these numbers, we have to keep in mind these are estimates, right? These are samples out of the population. So we don't know exactly that it's 28% say that Republicans believe the thing about the middle question there. But it is, there's usually what we call a little bit of margin of error. 2 to 3 percentage points on either side, okay? I don't mean to get too technical, but it is to say that when we look at a number like 28, we have to think, well, maybe like 25 to 30%. Or when we see 23, like 20 to 25 or 26. There's a little bit of a range, okay? And that number is in the middle of that range. So it's just to say that, the way that this is talked about sometimes and reported by our news outlets is not always it's not always said in the most accurate way, because again, we don't have censuses of the population, but we do have these samples of the population. So these are estimates, is the point. These three questions here, this is from a Public Religion Research Institute survey. Thousands of people surveyed, one of the higher quality surveys and reports we get semi-annually about people's conspiracy and just beliefs on politics and religion and other things. This is kind of acts as a good summary of kind of the principles of this QAnon belief system, right? Take a look at the questions that are asked here on the bottom of the screen. The government, I'll go from left to right here. The government, media, and financial worlds in the U.S. are controlled by a group of pedophiles who run a global child sex trafficking operation. Okay. Now, this is really extreme, right? This is asking directly the American public, like maybe the most specific, extreme version of this conspiracy, right? That it's not only a cabal of people that are in charge and are conspiring, but they also do all of this other evil stuff, all right? Then we've got a second question in the middle here. There is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. This is kind of getting at that portion of the ideology about overthrow of government, right? There's a storm coming. This is the way that QAnon conspiracy believers talk about this, the sort of the overthrow of the government that will come by sort of, whatever means. And so that sort of measures that part of the ideology. And then on the right-hand side, because things have gotten so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence in order to save the country. This is a measure of the willingness to violence, or the support, I shouldn't say the willingness to actually act on it, but at least the support of it more passively, at least that, by, again, this language that QAnon members use, the true patriots, right? We talked about that before. The citizen movement here, that is to try to overthrow the government. Okay, so these are measures of basically the main principles of the belief system. What do we see? Well, we would first expect, I suppose, that Republicans would poll higher significantly on this than other groups, and we certainly see that. We've got what? Pretty consistent, right? 23 up to 28. So we could say generally maybe a fifth to a third, maybe like 20 to 30% if we do our range here and kind of estimate. That, a sizable percentage of Republicans believe, in a pretty extreme form, are saying they believe a lot of, many of the principles of this ideology pretty consistently. So that is certainly a significant number. A large plurality, we would say. A plurality is, something that is can have political power. It's large enough to be a faction and have factional power in our national politics. And so certainly, 20 to 30% is certainly qualifies as that. I direct your attention to the purplish bar between the Republicans and Democrats. Look at the independents. Independents poll quite high on this too. 14%, 18%, 13%. So we could more accurately say maybe anywhere from 10 to 20% of independents actually believe across the principles of this ideology as well. Double-digit percentage of independent, self-identified independent voters. So actually, there are even a few Democrats. Yes, I know that's surprising, but there's even a handful there that poll on this ideology as well. Now you say, how in the world does that happen? Well, this shows us, there are a lot of there are some folks in any society, including the United States, that just don't follow politics much, don't have a lot of political knowledge. It's not to critique anybody; it just happens, of course. And so they may not even associate this explicitly with the Republican Party, and so maybe they have some conspiracy beliefs, and they see some value to this ideology. Okay, so it can happen across parties. Okay, but so the point is here we have, we have a sizable plurality certainly in the Republican Party, and even some decent sized, when we talk about, I mean, this is a very extreme expression of these beliefs. I mean, that's certainly troubling when looking at those numbers. When you look at the more extreme versions of the statements, those are really, really quite high. There's a lot going on here, so I'm going to direct your attention. If you can see my cursor, I'm waving it over here, one thing up here sort of in the left middle corner here. There's a lot here. I'm going to focus you on one question here, okay, that I've got my cursor over. What it shows here, this is from an Ipsos NPR poll, National Public Radio poll. They also do very high quality samples. Measuring one of these principles of the belief system, right? And in a very extreme way. A group of Satan worshiping elites run a child sex ring. Okay, again, it's really high conspiracy, like extreme on the extreme end sort of statement in there. And these folks are trying to control our politics and media. Large scale cabal, doing evil things. Okay. Now this one gets a little more complicated. We'll go back to more simple ones, more straightforward ones in the coming minutes. But this one's kind of interesting though. This is measuring among Republicans, Democrats, Independents. How many people basically answer this question sort of correctly? That is to say, like, how many actually say affirmatively, like unequivocally, that statement is false? Like, that's not what's happening. That's total bunk. That's, explicitly that's false. And that's what's being measured here. So, for example, only 14% of Republicans unequivocally say that that is false. Luckily, a lot more Democrats say that is false too. Now, I don't, that makes the situation look probably even a lot more bleak, right? And I want to caution you all. I don't put a lot of weight on that type of the way that question is asked, because it kind of becomes a logic problem when you're asking it to somebody like, is this true? Is this false? How does that compute with my ideology? So I don't put a lot of weight on this one. I'll go back to ones we put more weight on here in the coming slides. I just wanted to show you this particular one though, because it does show you that, I suppose it displays one thing, in a sense that for somebody to actually firmly say that this is not what is happening is actually a pretty low percentage. So maybe it makes the problem look a little more concerning than maybe it actually is. It's kind of an interesting take on it, but anyway, I just wanted to show that sort of quickly because it is another way of sort of asking the question to people in these polls. Let's go back to more traditional polling here, okay? Let's get more into the more specific issues then. We look at a summary, and again, I would state that if you look at the sort of summary slide I gave you early, if you look at any of the polls that you see in your large media outlets about this the past few years, the numbers we saw are pretty consistent with what you would see in most any other polls. So that's why I show some of these to be consistent with what is out there in other polls. There is a deep state working to undermine former President Trump. Okay, now this is, again, getting back, it's not the most extreme version of that statement, right? It's not like saying there's an evil cabal, but it's saying there's a deep state. Like there are bad acting public officials and there are bad acting political actors that are trying to undermine our leader, our current designated leader, former President Trump, and that sort of thing. Okay, so so this is a little more moderate statement, but still we can learn some things from this. And we see here then broken down by party affiliation. This is from the most recent large-scale NPR poll, National Public Radio poll as well. Again, representative of what we see in other polls as well. And we see, and what's nice about these is that you can see the parsing out. Strong agreement versus kind of agree versus somewhat disagree versus strongly agree and don't know and all of that. Okay, so again, we got probably what we would expect somewhat, right? Okay, Republicans, I'll drag my cursor here. Okay, so more Republicans, certainly significantly more than other affiliated groups, believe this stuff either strongly or somewhat. But look when you put the numbers together, right? If we measure out of registered Republican voters, either strongly, firmly believe it, or are at least partially believe in it, somewhat believe in it, you get what 72%, about 70 or over percent of the party. Again, this is pretty consistent with what we see with other polls. You add in the don't know category, maybe don't know but are dabbling in it a little bit. You could probably take a little percentage off of that as well. And you could get up into the 70s or 80% of the party, either QAnon full or QAnon adjacent. Okay, so again, that is a significant portion of Republicans. Look at the independents again. This is one of the things that when I started researching this a few years ago, when I was doing my own field work and trying to square it with the polling stuff, I was surprised at. I was shocked by. Independents do poll very, very high on some of these things. Certainly compared to Democrats, we would obviously expect Democrats to be very, very low on this, of course. If you add up the strongly and somewhat agrees on the independent side, we've got 30 to 40%. If you do your again sort of ranging with the estimate here. Maybe a third to 2 and 5 are into this ideology. A very high don't know in the independent category as well, about 1 in 5, about 20%. This is something consistent we see as well across any issue, including conspiracy theories. About independent voters, this is going to continue to be a theme as we go along here and then take questions. There is a high percentage outside of the Republican Party, independent affiliated voters that do consistently engage with and believe this ideology. It's very consistent to see a high percentage of don't know about an issue among independent voters. I think some people that maybe don't follow the news or follow politics too much, I think there's oftentimes a stereotype of independent voters that they are kind of moderate voters. Yeah, maybe they swing from like Republican to Democrat occasionally, but they're kind of in the middle. And they'll occasionally swing back and forth, given certain opportunities and certain candidates and that sort of thing. I want to tell you that we have decades of research on independent voters, and that is not at all the case. Independent voters, actually many of them, not all of them, of course, there are true moderate independents. Independent voters, there are many of them that actually swing between extremes. So instead of like a small, like a really short, small swing set, imagine like a really tall, like wide swing set. And they're swinging between like far left and far right. Oftentimes that's because they're not very high on political knowledge, so they don't necessarily recognize an extremist ideology when they see it. And so they'll latch onto extremist things even when they contradict each other. So anyway, all I'm saying with that is independent voters can be a lot more extreme than you think they can be. And we see this consistently even with the right of center, the nationalist style sort of ideology. We see independent voters really, there are a decent percentage of them that do poll and do show that they do believe in this sort of nationalist conspiracy set. A little more specific here, maybe more specific to our recent 2020 election, the voter fraud issue. Asking Americans here, did voter fraud help Joe Biden win the 2020 election? So again, this is not the really explicit rhetoric, not in this question, but it's still a serious conspiracy being forwarded, right? Voter fraud was rampant across many states, maybe all states, and okay, people believing that this is what caused President Biden to be elected and inaugurated. And you see here again, this is pretty consistent again with our other findings, right? Republicans again in that sort of if you add the strongly agree, somewhat agree, or up into like the 60, 70+% range, right, of them. Also a sizable don't know category. Independents, very similar. We've got that sort of 30 to 40% either somewhat or strongly agreeing with that statement. Obviously, Democrats are going to be very low. By the way, it's interesting, just one more little factoid here. This is also an interesting sort of thing we see in politics. Look back at the previous one and this one. I'll do it a couple times. Look at the Democrat side. You see the strongly disagree jump way up when you actually designate the Democratic Party politician that is being asked about. Like, okay, there's a deep state that's working to undermine Republicans. Well, okay, 60% of Democrats disagree with that. voter fraud, that's also a deep state concept, right? But it helped Joe Biden win. Well, 80% disagree with that, right? So again, it's not to make any big critiques here. It is just to say, once you actually specifically engage names of people that are affiliated with parties, that partisan affiliation just kicks in. Like you always see a little bit of a difference there, and here you actually see a pretty sizable difference in the strongly like, no, there's no way that could happen. So anyway, kind of interesting there. But so again, pretty consistent. We've got a large number of Republicans, a majority, it seems, are taking to at least some of these conspiracies, and there are a sizable number of independent voters too. Okay, a little more specific on these issues here. This one a little more hopefully pleasing. I know we're looking at numbers, but hopefully the explanation more dynamic than just numbers. This is a Morning Consult Politico poll, also a very used very large-scale samples, thousands of people across the U.S. population represented in this. Now, look at what's being measured here. This is looking at a very specific part of this is like a more issue level specific of the conspiracy beliefs. Former President Trump will be restored to the presidency soon, like this year. That's the question being asked here. Okay, so we're getting more specific as we go along. Now look at the date. I put this here intentionally because, okay, maybe we could understand logically, people thinking that, I know it's hard to understand this logically, some of these opinions, but okay, if we ask this question like, December of 2020, before Joe Biden was inaugurated, okay, maybe some Republicans would poll, they think Donald Trump will somehow be restored because they think there's voter fraud and all of this, portion of them do. This is asked 4 months into Joe Biden's presidency, right? June of 21. So I show this because this shows the sustainability of this belief system. It's one item that shows the consistency of it. Okay, essentially it's not going away. So you can have an inauguration, and then you can have this question asked where, and let's be clear, there's no such thing as presidential restoration. That's unconstitutional. Okay, I mean, once the electoral votes are certified by Congress, by Senate, then that's it. Even if there had been voter fraud, obviously there wasn't at any large scale. Obviously, a restoration of a previous president is just an unconstitutional, authoritarian type of thing. That doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. Yet, we look at, again, party affiliation, a breakdown here, somewhat and very likely in the blue and dark blue there, or greenish blue. Again, are sort of consistent, like 30%, this is sort of 29, 30% sort of range. Again, 1 in 4, 1 in 3 of Republicans somewhat or strongly agreeing with this. And this is a pretty extreme specific issue, right? So it shows a decent sized plurality that is in that more extreme end of the QAnon spectrum where they're saying, okay, even after months of the Biden presidency, somehow Donald Trump will still be, our nationalist leader will still be restored to office, okay? Now, we can take some solace, maybe. The independents are a fair amount lower on this one, like significantly lower. They're only 7 and 10%, very likely or somewhat likely. So I know these are relative. It's still not good that many people of independent affiliation actually believe this, but that's better than the previous ones we looked at. Okay, so we can say maybe our independent voters are somehow thinking a little more logically on some of these things than maybe our more extreme right-wing folks. And then there's a little bit of Democrat thrown in. That always happens. And then the all voters. Okay, so it's all. We'll summarize this here in a little bit. Okay, I'm gonna check my time here, see where we're at. Oh, we're at about 45 minutes, I think. So I'll try to wind this down here. Maybe next few slides, and then we'll take questions. A couple other things here. Let me do one or two other slides. Then we'll go to a sort of final estimate of this about the population. Then we'll do a discussion. A lot of stuff here. I try to direct your attention to sort of the top parts here. Okay, I basically everything above my cursor here. I'll put my cursor down there if you can see it. So looking at the things above that, we'll get it there. This is looking at measuring propensity for support for violence. Okay, sort of the revolution, the coup, the overthrow of the government, that sort of thing. We, of course, saw a little bit of this on January 6th, unfortunately, right? So this statement, true American patriots might have to resort to violence in order to save our country. Now, again, this is not, now let's be clear, this is not, as social scientists like me, we have to be very specific about what we're measuring in the question here. This is not saying that these people would do violence, of course, but it is saying that they could support violence to this ideological end, okay? So let's be clear about that. Obviously still troubling, of course, but we do want to make that clear, that's what we're measuring. Again, Republican, Independent, Democrat parsing out here. So again, pretty consistent, right? That 30% Republican agreeing with the more extreme sort of support for violence. Sizable plurality of the party, okay? Independents still consistently, again, so this is all pretty consistent, significantly higher than Democrats. 17% of independents saying that this they would potentially support violence to this sort of end to get rid of an establishment or a deep state or something like that. And what we would expect here, we see this a sort of interesting breakdown by within the Republican part by most trusted news source. Okay, so those within the Republican Party, those folks that say that Fox News is their most trusted source, or a more far-right news source like One American News Network or Newsmax or some online source, or some that trust the mainstream news as their main source, like a CNN or a CBS or ABC or something. We would expect, the higher on the far right news sources, the more support for this. Okay, 40%, it jumps up to that. Look, what's troubling here, I find, is that those that say the mainstream news, like a CBS nightly news or an ABC or something like that, that's their most trusted source. Like, they're not saying they're always looking at far right sources. Still, 1 in 5 of Republicans will say they may support violence to, overthrow the government. So, I mean, that's, again, that shows how deep this can run. Okay, so it's again, that one was certainly a little stood out to me on this one, and a little bit concerning. Let me see here. I'm gonna skip ahead here. So let me close down here with then sort of our sort of estimates, and then we'll take questions. I think it's maybe, so we have, I hope I've shown you, we have pretty consistent understanding of who supports this ideology in the population. And I think I've sort of, hopefully been able to talk you through a little bit the levels of that and who it's among, and, that it's pretty consistent. We see it across many different highly precise and highly trusted sources, okay? So what I'm just going to do a couple slides here. I wanted to put some actual numbers on this so we could actually maybe more generally think about this, okay? If we take some of these numbers, and now I say here clearly these are estimates, okay? And now I would also say too, I am doing what I would call conservative estimates. Conservative with a small c, not the political conservative, okay? Conservative meaning, I'm trying to be on sort of the safe low end of the estimates here, okay? We can estimate out, maybe more liberally with this, but I want to try to be like, I think we solidly know this, okay? So if we look at people that are self-identified Republican voters or Republican supporters, I've parsed it into 3 categories. What I would call complete QAnon belief, some QAnon belief, and light QAnon belief. Complete QAnon belief would be, again, those people that believe across all the principles in usually the most extreme form. There's this evil cabal. They must be taken out of the government. We must restore power to us through violence and all the most extreme end, and they believe all of it. Okay, that's complete QAnon. Some QAnon would be like, okay, they believe a decent proportion of those principles, but not every single one, and maybe not every single one in the most extreme form. So, for example, a some QAnon person would be maybe somebody that says, okay, I believe, maybe believes in the evil cabal existing that conspires against others, but they don't necessarily think that, okay, we don't have to overthrow the government. We don't necessarily believe in violence, that sort of thing. Okay, so it's sort of partial QAnon belief. And again, this is consistent with what we see in our research and in the various polls too, that these people exist. And then there's light QAnon. Light QAnon I still put up as sort of a concerning category, because, okay, maybe they believe in just 1 or 2 or 3 of the issues, the specific issues, or maybe a principle or 2, but they're dabbling in it a little more. But they still believe one of these or a few of these conspiracies enough to be concerning. Okay, So somebody that is like QAnon, maybe that's, somebody who's saying, okay, I think there's a Democratic Party controlled deep state in Washington, D.C., and, they're really bad and they're doing bad stuff to everybody else in the country. But, and maybe that's that and a few other things is as far as it goes. But that's still really, obviously, it's not anywhere near an accurate portrayal of reality, of course. But it's also a very high conspiracy mindset, even though it's not encompassing the entire ideology, okay? So if you look at these three categories, these are all separate then and you add them all up. I'm basically saying if you look at Republican-affiliated folks, I would say generally across the conspiracy spectrum here, we've got about 47% at least that are either lightly in this or all the way in this. And I would say about 10% of that is sort of the full, 10% of Republicans are basically sort of full in this ideology, okay? And again, I would say that's pretty consistent with what we've seen in the polls. To put some actual numbers on that, we have over 250 million adults in the United States. We're a gigantic country, of course, third largest country by population in the world. So this becomes a lot of people, right? That's, I would estimate anywhere, around 19 or so million Republicans would be somewhat in the QAnon spectrum, the complete conspiracy spectrum, which would constitute about 7% of the total U.S. adult population, okay? Let me do one more of these because independents also poll highly. So I wanted to do the exact same things with independents because they do poll, as I showed you, I think maybe surprisingly high on this ideology. So same exact categories as the others. Okay, I don't have to explain them again, I don't think, but just among people that self-identify as independents, not Democrats or Republicans. Now you notice here that some of the percentage numbers are smaller, but you get bigger absolute numbers. That's because there are more independents than there are Republicans or Democrats. So we have to remember that independent is a large category. So if you add all these up, again, the percentages are smaller, but you get, cumulative among independents. I would say, again, about 19 million independents are somewhere on the QAnon spectrum as far as what they consume through media, what they purport to believe in their in polling data and field work and other things. If you add it all together, independents, Republicans, across the entire U.S. population, I'm estimating, and I think this is consistent again with the data we have on this. I would say, I put an estimate here of 17% of the U.S. adult population. I would range it basically between 15 and 20%, something like that. Okay. Now a reminder, that is the whole QAnon spectrum here. That's not, full in all the way in, supporting everything. That's dabbling in it, having maybe partial interest, partial belief, all the way up to including the full smaller percentage that is actually full into it, okay? If you take that as an estimate of the adult U.S. population, we're talking a sizable portion of the American people. I am sorry to report that, but it is a sizable portion. You could even cut that in half. 20 million is still concerning, let alone maybe 40 million or more. So the point is, the reason we're seeing this in our politics is because it's a large constituency. It has taken over one of our two major parties because it's tens of millions of people. And once you get tens of millions of people believing some set of issues about politics, whatever it is, even if it's a sort of extremist conspiracy set of beliefs, you will have it take over factions of a party and maybe even an entirety of a party. And that's what we've certainly seen with Republicans. Okay, I think I'll stop there, I think. Thank you to you all. Put up my contact information here briefly too, and I can take on the screen here in just a second. And if we have any questions, let's do questions. So hopefully that was valuable, and maybe we can have some dynamic discussion about these issues off of that.
Okay, I think it would make sense if let me put my video back on. If you put your name in the chat, and then Dr. Chapman can call on you, and you can speak your question, and there can be a little more dialogue.
Sounds great, Ellen.
So I'll start with a first question of,
sure.
What's the interrelationship between white nationalism and Q?
Sure. So there is some, here's the way I would put it. white national. Let's specify that a little bit first. Um, we know some of our group names. I think as far white nationalists tend to be, of course, the most extreme on this extreme end, right? They tend to believe the full spectrum of the ideology, of course. They obviously have ethnic and racial tinged beliefs that drive those conspiracy beliefs, and are certainly more focused on the racial issues, of course, than others by definition. What the white nationalists and white nationalist groups that they affiliate tend to do, let's take like the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, these sort of large paramilitary organizations and militia groups that many white nationalists join, either officially or otherwise, or support through donations and so forth. They tend to be the drivers online of these conspiracy theories. That's their big contribution here. If you look at our politics today, I think I try to break down stereotypes a lot. A lot of people tend to look at politics as like a top-down thing, right? Okay, so, former President Trump, Republican political officials, they're talking about all these conspiracy theories recently, voter fraud, all this other stuff. And sometimes people think, well, voters listen to that and then they just mimic that. And certainly that is sometimes the case. But it's also the case that if you trace the origins of these conspiracy theories, from the specific ones to the more generalized conspiracies, they come from, oftentimes are crowdsourced from originally white nationalist sort of message boards and discussion boards and websites online. I submit to you that what a lot of Donald Trump has done the past 5-6 years since coming into our political public life in 2015 is he's been crowdsourcing stuff from the internet. If you look at all of these conspiracies and other things that he pushes out, they have their origins oftentimes in white nationalist message boards online. So the actual message, what elected officials, political officials like him and others have done is they've given a wider spread, a wider audience for these things, which is why you're seeing it more widespread in the electorate. And also they're giving a sort of elite permission to say, okay, look at us, we're well off, elected officials, and and we're saying this stuff. So you all in the country, you can say this stuff now too and believe it. And you can believe it in public and tell your friends about it, and it's all okay. So I hope I'm sort of addressing your question, Ellen. One of the main ways in which white nationalists and white nationalist groups really affect this whole movement, in ways they are kind of the starting point of this movement, because they are oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the origins of this whole conspiracy story. And then the elected officials pick up on that after it's sort of spread and trended online a little bit in these circles. They pick up on it, and then it spreads even further in the population. Does that make sense? And so I hope I'm answering your question there. So maybe just one more thing with that, even more broadly, there are certainly, out of the estimates that we have and that I gave you, let's take like the 10% of Republicans I'm saying are like full QAnon, okay? Like fully believe the ideology. I would say that's pretty consistent with what we know so far. How many of those are actually white nationalists? Like, we take the really hardcore QAnon folks. The reason I didn't give data on that is it's a little harder to know, just because white nationalists are so reluctant to express their actual opinions in polls. So it's unfortunately a very difficult thing to measure. But I can tell you, if we look across the population more broadly, the racism thing is a concern in that the origins of these conspiracies often start with that stuff, and they do spread because of it. But it's when we look at the more in mass movement, it's not the biggest factor once it gets to a broader population. Does that make sense? So it's sort of the origin story of it, if you will, but it's not once it spreads wider, it's not, for goodness sakes, 50% of Republicans are not, I'm not arguing are racist in the absolute, really, high definition of that term, like, actively discriminating and hold, really hardcore racist beliefs. I'm certainly not arguing that. So there's a small percentage of the full QAnon group that I would say is certainly white nationalists, just given some of these small estimates that we have. And they do originate a lot of this stuff online that then others pick up on and spread. So they are the origins of this stuff, if you will. So hopefully that that helps with the white nationalism thing.
Okay, so it looks like Steve Hockman has a question for you. Steve, do you want to unmute yourself?
So other than QAnon, you brought up Trump a lot. What do you think would happen if Trump disappeared from the political scene or died? Would anything change at this point?
One of the reasons why I showed that after the inauguration, sort of, now I know that after inauguration, will Trump be restored is actually about Donald Trump. First of all, well, second of all, I do want to say I don't mean to mention him. He's been mentioned way too much generally, and we should get beyond talking about him. I mean, one of the themes I maybe I didn't do a good enough job of bringing out. One of the things I'm trying to say here is that this is now spread across out into the country. It's out into the population. This is one of our two major parties. And so look, there you can go on. Remember, I don't know if you were at our last talk, but I know some of you were. If we look at the media, like the high conspiracy media outlets, Natural News, Liberty Daily, all these other ones I showed you last time, there are now, I can show you anytime, there are Trump critic pieces now in the nationalist circles, like that are critiquing Donald Trump. I mean, they're not common, but they do now appear because, you know, he's actually come out kind of saying like you should take the vaccine for COVID. You know, he's kind of done these other things because I think at some level he actually understands like there actually are moderate voters out there that I have to win at some point if I'm going to try to legitimately be president again. I mean, there's maybe at least a little bit of practicality in that brain somewhere. You know, so the point is, if this movement easily has it's a political ideology in the movement. It does not have to have any one specific leader leading it. I would submit to you that you know, that Ron DeSantis, who also polls sort of second to Donald Trump in the 24 presidential primary and all of that, he's actually out-nationaled Donald Trump in many ways. He's actually sort of anti-vaccine and all these other things. He's actually in many ways become as extreme or even more extreme on some issues than he has. And so, you know, there are now representatives that poll, you know, at decent levels, just like a few years before any presidential primary, that could have competition with him. I'm not saying he wouldn't be the nominee if he wants to run. He certainly would be at this point. But again, understanding this as a political ideology, like any other extremist ideology, it can exist across multiple leaders. And so I at this point, it would probably lose a little steam, honestly, maybe a few percentage points just because of the nature of Donald Trump as kind of an entertainer and being known as an entertainer. He does have that sort of pizzazz, I suppose, that maybe a Josh Hawley or a Ron DeSantis doesn't have. But it's still easily enough of the party. You know, if we learned one thing from the 1 year post 2020 election, it was a big question of what was going to happen to the Republican Party. I think we have generally a pretty clear answer from looking at the electorate and looking at the politics. You know, it's actually gotten more extreme in some ways. So this can easily, I would say, easily exist beyond one person. And again, you can look in nationalist media outlets and these conspiracy websites, and you can actually now find Trump critical pieces that's saying he's not going far enough. And they get decent number of views too. So I'm sorry, I know this is the bad news part. But it's, yeah, I know, I do the same thing. But it is here to stay in some sense, and it is a longer term problem. I'm sorry to say that we are going to have to understand and deal with. I preview my January 27th talk, the last one in the series, because we're going to be much more proactively positive in that one in a couple months. We're going to talk about solutions, about how we talk about this with our friends and how we try to persuade them, and, you know, possible policy and political solutions and that sort of thing. But yes, we are in this for the medium to long haul, I would say. So if that answers your question. All right. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Anyone else have a question? Oh, I was going to say, does anyone else have a question? I do, but
Sure.
I will wait for anyone else. If anyone else, I'll cede the floor. Anyone else have something they want to ask? Okay, well,
These are good.
Yeah.
These are good questions. We're exploring the nature of the more specific beliefs and the origins of them, and also, you know, in any sort of authoritarian ideology like this, who is the leader is certainly a question too, and we've certainly had a a very prominent leader of this movement going back some years. So
Right.
these are certainly, pertinent questions. So
Yeah, no, it's kind of scary
good
actually
questions.
that the movement's outgrown Trump. That's not
Yes.
a little unsettling. So
Let, let me,
I don't want to
can
preempt.
I give a little good news before you ask your question? I know this is all
Sure.
these are all downers. Let's remember how quick, these political realignments happen quickly.
Okay.
Remember back in summer of 2015 when the nationalist leader Donald Trump came about, and we suddenly had polling data that showed him like instantly like going up to the top and staying there, and this movement coalesced really quickly. Political realignments can happen quickly. As quickly as we get into this, something can happen in the future that we don't know, and we can quickly get out of it. Okay, so I want to remind ourselves of that too. It's these things can change more quickly than we think. I don't necessarily predict that. It's hard to predict the future. Again, I think this is here to stay for quite some time. But yes, I'm sorry to interrupt. So
Yeah, so
just wanted
that
to be a little more positive.
no, that actually leads right into my question, which is I don't want to preempt your next talk, but so I want to ask about what do you think, what strategies for acting here in the U.S. But
Sure.
historically, are there can you think of cases historically where this kind of like a sort of ultranationalist movement
Right.
got started, but then kind of was somehow cut short before it actually rose to complete power?
Sure. So I think I'll address one aspect of the solutions to sort of preview the next talk. I'll leave the interpersonal conversations for January 27th. Let me talk more political here, our national politics for a second. Maybe that'll be appropriate given the previous questions. I actually cite a political scientist on this. His name is Steve Tellis. He's at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He's written about this a lot. He's an excellent research political scientist. He notes very rightly that historically, if you think about our politics, Republican, Democrat, think back to the 80s, 70s, 60s, within a couple of generations, we used to have things called political factions, right? Southern Democrats, Northeast Republicans, all these different sort of factions within our big two-party system. I would submit to you that one of the ways politically out of this, there still exist Republicans, of course, even Republican elected officials. I could name a few. There are not many these days, but I can name a few that don't go along with this ideology, certainly, and are still traditional, maybe normal, if you could say, Republicans in a sense. I think we need to have much more explicitly folks like that forming explicit coalitions and factions within the party. In some ways, they kind of act like if any of you follow the news recently, there are congressional members like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, Republicans who are on the January 6th committee. They've been sort of outed by the Nationalists and the Republican Party because they're not going along with the QAnon ideology and the conspiracy stuff at all. They're actually fighting against it. Our political margins in the country are so even. One or two or three representatives or senators can have tons of power in our system. If we could get a few of our elected officials who would just come out and form a faction and say, okay, we are this type of Republican, like name themselves like explicitly and say, we are this type of Republican, we're not this other type of conspiracy Republican. We're like this more normal type of Republican, right? And if you do it more explicitly and actually name yourself and brand yourself, politics is about branding and marketing and getting an audience and getting voters. I would think that we would have more at the state level, just generally in our Congress, more people running on that sort of platform. You have to balance the power within the party somehow, intra-party. And so we used to have this. We've gone through cycles in our history where we've had, explicit factions, operating factions within our big two-party tents. And so I would say that's one of the big strategies. Hopefully I answer your question a little bit. And it's really, it's not the most out there sort of proposal. I think we could see something like that actually practically could be done. It's not the most out there sort of thing. It is realistic. It's just very hard for the first person to make that move, because if the first person, like the first Republican that comes out and critiques the conspiracy stuff a bit, they get, ganged upon. So you've got to find somebody else and maybe do it with a small group. Look at how much power Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema had in the recent legislative negotiations in the Senate. I mean, our margins are so thin. You
Right.
get 1, 2, 3 people together to form a faction, they can stop anything and have political power instantly. So I would encourage, and I hope people are, I think people are, at least some advisors are trying to advise some Republicans to form an explicit faction, name themselves and say, okay, we are these type of Republicans. Run on our ticket, run like us,
Yeah.
and be like us and gain some power.
That's very
Hopefully that
interesting.
answers your question.
Yeah, no, that does. Ellen, you had a question. You want to unmute yourself?
Sure.
Or do you want me to go ahead?
Yeah, I have to unmute and then read it because do Q followers appreciate the anti-Semitic component of their beliefs?
No. So there has been and is a growing anti-Semitic portion of especially the full QAnon spectrum. Yes. And is this Ellen? Is this actually your question, or I saw it was from your
Yes,
name there?
yes.
So or you were
Yes.
okay. No, this is a very pertinent question, and obviously for the audience we have here too. So there's this huge contradiction in the Republican Party right now, right? You've got this growing conspiracy set that is in some circles highly anti-Semitic, unfortunately. And yet you have the historical legacy of a party that has been, generally speaking, pro-Israel. And so you have this weird melding where you've got these two, if you take issues surrounding the Jewish population, you have constituencies within the Republican Party that are now diametrically opposed on those sorts of things in some ways. The historical legacy of the party has held policy-wise, I suppose, right, in the sort of upper circles and but there is this growing online presence among the white nationalists, obviously, as we talked about before, Ellen, and among that 10% of Republicans full QAnon spectrum. I would not put the anti-Semitic in the sun, certainly not the light, and partially the sun, but not much. It's mostly in the full QAnon, the ones that are, hardcore into it. They don't, it's hard to get your head around, but I've in my field work, I have interviewed and been with people that have expressed what I would certainly call pretty explicit anti-Semitic beliefs, conspiracies involving Jewish control of things, George Soros. We could go along the whole list. And yet they will then talk about being pro-Israel and they will hold all of these things together simultaneously. It's a really, understand that there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in the way that people think about issues. It is very common for people to hold simultaneously issues that don't necessarily make sense when you lay them all out together. And so there's been a decent proportion, again, in my field work among more extreme nationalists that will communicate simultaneously sort of pro-Jewish and anti-Jewish sort of sentiment. So I don't know if I'm clearly answering your question or not, Ellen, but it is to say, do they appreciate the anti-Semitic component of their belief? I would say because of a lot of the cognitive dissonance, the contradictions that some of them hold, not all of them, but some of them, I would say in that sense, no, because they don't maybe think through all of those contradictions or all of the potential outcomes of their beliefs. I don't know if that makes sense as an answer, but that's certainly what I've found. So is it a big part of it? It's a decent proportion of it's a large proportion of the white nationalist component, obviously. And it has bled into a little more mainstream recently. We see that in some polls. Yes.
Okay, and I think
We have
Karen Mendelow Nelson, who I knew from high school, and is joining us from afar, as a question, if she can unmute herself.
Oh, hi there. I just wanted to ask you, Brandon, what do you think about this kind of, it's like a scheme that these extreme Republicans in Congress are getting publicity stunts for harassing other members of Congress, and the press that they're getting for this with, these anime death threats, racial epithets against other Congress people, and they're not being held to account to the norms that people would be held to account in general work settings, and the press that they're getting for this and how it's influencing the ideology that you're talking about.
I hate it's a wonderful question and a timely question, Karen, because we are seeing more of that, and there was of course a very explicit incident recently with Paul Gosar, a Republican congressman from Arizona, about making the anime videos and things like this showing violence against other members of Congress, and there have been anti-Semitic ones as well. I am sorry to say that if you look at the press statements and a lot of our communications, official communications to their constituencies from our elected federal congressional members of Congress, that's a lot of the point now. A lot of the point is to get eyeballs, to get attention. We are in an attention economy now with our online news and our bombardment of many different sources of attention that we have in our daily lives. It's bleeding over into our politics, I hate to say. And so as horrid as that stuff is, you can look at some of the more extreme members of Congress. Madison Cawthorn is one of them. He's a Republican from North Carolina. He's had a lot of statements about overthrowing the government and violence and all this stuff, on the spectrum of QAnon, certainly full QAnon. And in one of his press statements, when he became a congressional member, he said, I'm emphasizing my communications department, my communications people. I'm gonna focus on communications, meaning I don't necessarily care about policy much. I'm gonna focus on communicating with my constituency. And that's what I'm gonna spend money on, and I'm gonna focus on in my daily work. And we have more and more. And again, it's sort of a two-way street here. The causation is sort of two-way between the electorate and our elected officials. I mean, look, in any democracy, in any democratic republic, our elected officials in some ways reflect us, as I'm talking broadly, the American public, the many different subgroups within the American public, because people vote for them actively. So, so it's a two-way causation sort of thing. But there are a lot of conspiracy folks that like the trolling sort of stuff, that like the entertainment portion of this. I mean, I know it sounds really bad and really horrid, but for some people and some maybe not so people that are thinking clearly about politics and about policy and about things, for them it's kind of a degraded form of entertainment almost. And so I submit that you're going to continue to see a little bit of that. And yes, look, our elected officials certainly need to punish it when it happens. Obviously, I mean, we need to have clear moral rules, ethical rules among our federal officials, our state officials, any elected officials, certainly. And obviously, we need to consistently apply those. So will the parties do that? Will our officials do that? Hopefully they will and will continue to. But Karen, hopefully I'm answering your question here. It's a conspiracy environment promotes this sort of bravado, if you will. I mean, you look back at the historical examples. That's what Mussolini, Hitler, others, any nationalist or fascist leader is. It's about this sort of. There's also a communication style about it as well. That we are, there's a sort of denigration of the norms and rules, right? And so that's a part of this too. So we have a few more congressional folks that are getting elected from these districts where we have large concentrations of QAnon believing people that are going to troll and are going to do this sort of thing, and it's explicitly what they kind of campaign on too. It's like, I'm going to go and I'm going to make Democrats mad, and that's not healthy. Not at all, but it is a part of it's a part of the whole package, essentially. The presentation of the conspiracies and again the hatred of the other group. You have to poke at them. a lot, and that's what we're seeing. Hopefully, did I answer your question, Karen?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you. I
When I
know,
see
bad
it,
news. I'm sorry, but we have
I
to look. We have to insist that our federal officials uphold and consistently apply moral and ethical norms, right? And so, call your congressperson, tell them that this is not acceptable. Again, we'll look at strategies about how to do this interpersonally and otherwise, and how to improve these issues. But yes, it is a part of that communication style is unfortunately it is consistent with the ideology, isn't it? It's about this sort of bravado, and it's about this sort of extremism.
I see that Ollie has a question.
Called out.
Okay.
Hi. I guess this is not really a question, but it's more of a comment because it's because like on like talking about the Israel and anti-Semitism thing, specifically, it's like just because people are like okay with Israel doesn't mean that they're not anti-Semitic, because Israel is a country that isn't. I mean, it is meant to see as a Jewish homeland, but it's like it's a country in its own right, in that fact. And I think a lot of people don't like you feel like, oh, like they like Israel, so they don't hate the Jews, and I'm like, no, they still believe. So
Of course, yes. No, and I certainly did not mean to explicitly link those two. What the only reason, Ollie, I pulled from that is just because it is one of the more prominent issues historically that has been addressed by the party. So I certainly did not mean to explicitly link that. So certainly understood, of course. Yes. But we have seen certainly more incidents of anti-Semitic violence, those sorts of things recently in the country. Anti-Defamation League has excellent surveys on that, showing how that has increased. I can say that from what's generally happening with that, if you look at a lot of the Anti-Defamation League's work on this, is that it's not necessarily that across the U.S. population that anti-Semitic opinion is necessarily rising. It's that the folks that are extreme on this end are more prone to violence and acting out on these things than previous years, previous decades, that sort of thing. So if we look at sort of polling data on that, that's and just the incident rates of these things as well. The incidents, both violent and nonviolent, have gone up, and it's because, again, I would sort of link it back to this larger conspiracy mindset that's across a lot of the population now. There's this sort of, permission structure that's been given by elected officials and elites, if you will, to sort of act out more extreme rhetoric and these sorts of things, and that can then lead to, the acting out even physically of these extremist beliefs in, more than in previous years as well. So.
Yeah, Dr. Chapman, it occurs to me that there's another dimension maybe to the right-wing support of Israel versus their anti-Semitic stance, which is there's this tie-in for some people, and I don't know whether this is my question, I guess, how much does this represent the QAnon community? Because there's certainly a tie-in with certain kind of right-leaning American Christian communities to the state of Israel that has really nothing to do with Judaism. It has more to do with ideas about, the coming of the Messianic age. Is that part of the QAnon sort of philosophy?
That's certainly exactly right. And again, it's you have to understand too. There's a lot of people that are in this QAnon spectrum, again, that just don't have even a lot of knowledge about politics or world events in general. So there can be a mishmash of a lot of different things that are contradictory within one individual, and they'll still, So yes, it's sort of to go along with that. We look at the term, like you talk about the Christian community. You look at the term evangelical, which is obviously a oftentimes used term in terms of politics, of political constituency, because they often tend to vote more right of center, generally speaking, that sort of thing. Often associated with some QAnon spectrum recently too as well. Some percentage of evangelicals believing that and being on that spectrum, certainly. There was an increase over the past few years of white Americans identifying as evangelical. Yet we are getting more secular as a country. Now, there have been a lot of political scientists, social scientists that have studied this. What seems to be going on is that even, the sort of what's been obviously a Christian identity, evangelical, a Christian, belief system identity stance, is now becoming a political stance, like explicitly a political, meaning that people that don't go to church, we have in polling data now, a decent percentage of people that are voting Republican that are saying they're evangelical, but they don't actually attend. I'm not saying they're not truly evangelical, of course. I'm just saying there's no church attendance. There doesn't seem to be almost any engagement from the evidence we have on them that they're engaging with the religion, and yet they're calling themselves evangelical, like they really believe they are. Evangelical is becoming a more explicit political term than a religious term in some quarters of the country. So we're seeing that too. So there's, again, this sort of weird mix of religious identity and political identity kind of mixing together, and yeah, so it gets a little complicated. But who would have guessed that people identifying evangelical would rise in 2020 and 2021? But it has. But it seems to be more about the politics than it is about the religion, because where the rise occurs is among people that are not, it seems, in their community or actively engaging in the religion. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Anyone else have any questions for Dr. Chapman? Rich?
He's on his own phone.
He usually has questions. All right, anyone else? All right, Ellen, I'll turn it over.
Okay, then our next session is January 27th. We'll also be at 7 o'clock, and that on this session, we'll be focusing, Dr. Chapman will be focusing on solutions, which now that we've gotten ourselves all worried and concerned, hopefully there's something we can do about this.
we will be much more positive next time, I promise.
So thank you everyone for joining us, and happy Hanukkah. And for those who who observe Christmas, Merry Christmas, and we'll see you in the next year. Thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
See you, everybody. Thank you again, everybody. Excellent
Ellen.
questions from everyone.